So hello, this slam is in English, even though it's written Danish, so you all understand English. My name is Romain Barres, and I'm going to introduce you this slam, which is about the irritability of diabetes. So we know that our world has a big problem. In the world, 382 million people are affected with diabetes. And this number was supposedly happening in the year 2030, which means that we're more than 15 years ahead of the estimates. Now the new number is that in 2030 we'll be having 260 more million people affected, summing up to half a billion people in the world. That's 7% of the world population, and that's the population of the entire European Union. So what is causing diabetes? Well, we know that obesity leads to diabetes, and we know that the obesity pandemic is stemming from the industrialization in the 20th century, which was associated with a better access to food, while saving us from job-related strenuous physical activity. In the same time, in this period, life expectancy has moved from 45 years of age to 75 years of age of now. So clearly we don't want to revert back to the 1900s, but we need to do something to address the problem of diabetes and obesity. What do we know? We know that obesity has a heritable component. What does it mean? It means that if our ancestor had diabetes, we are, ourselves, at more risk of developing the disease. But what is transmitted from one generation to the next? Is it the genes? Or is it the way our parents eat or behave? They educated us a certain way. Or is it the way they eat and move before having us that changed the semen cells that was transmitted? Or is it something else? This is what we're going to present to you today. 3 main theories called genetics, epigenetics, and metagenomics that could be explaining the cause of the diabetes irritability. So please welcome the slammers.
Hello. I had a short encounter with a guy that passed away 2 years ago, just this morning. It wasn't a religious or divine moment. It was just the look of my granddad looking back at me in the bathroom mirror. My name is Nikolaj Krag, and I am here to convince you that the genetic blueprint or the genetic fingerprint that is in our genes affect not only our looks or our height, but also our tendency to get diabetes and obesity. I currently do research in how the genetic fingerprint in our genes affect the tendency to get diabetes, high blood sugar levels, or even cholesterol levels. We know for a fact, as mentioned in the introduction, that a lot of people experience diabetes and obesity. Just by pure statistics, in Denmark, 1 in 13 will have or will get type 2 diabetes during their lifetime. We know that type 2 diabetes runs in families. For example, if one of us slammers had a brother or a sister or a father or a mother experiencing type 2 diabetes, we would have a double risk of getting type 2 diabetes ourselves. We also know for a fact that twin studies show that identical twins are more prone to get type 2 diabetes when their fellow twin also has got type 2 diabetes, irrespective of where they live and which environment they're in. So they can live far apart and even though have an increased risk. So how do we go on from this knowledge? Well, the very small, subtle changes in our genes may show us who, why, and when we get disease. In every one of our cells, there is you could say a set of instructions, a recipe for how the cell would work properly. every word in the recipe is a letter in the sequence of our genes, you could say. Once in a while, the letters of our cells' recipes get changed, or the words in the recipe get changed. I don't know what that effect would have if we were to use that recipe, for example, a dish of some sort. But imagine if just one word in your recipe got changed. That's analogous to a letter change in our genes. For example, if I had a normal variation in the gene called FTO, I could increase my body weight with as much as 3 kilograms just by one letter or one word in your recipe, you could say. However, I have been genotyped and I know for a fact that I don't have the normal variation, so that is why I'm so slim and skinny, obviously. Anyway, we've also seen just recently in Inuit population of Greenland that another variation in another gene called TBC1D4, doesn't matter, affects blood sugar levels quite dramatically. It increases the risk of type 2 diabetes by as much as 10 times. So 10 times increased risk compared to those who hasn't got the normal variation. So if you would spend just 2 seconds with me to look into the future, we might use normal genetic variation to identify who among us will get the disease, why we get the disease, and when possibly it will start. If we're successful, we might be able to treat the disease better. We might be able to postpone the diagnosis of disease. And if we are very successful, we might prevent disease altogether. So with that, I will just say, next time you look into the mirror, try to reflect on who looks back. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Ida Duncan. You just heard Nikolai tell us about that what we get from our parents is the same thing we pass forward to our children. I want to convince you otherwise. I want to tell you that Darwin was wrong. It's not just in our genes, it's around our genes. We're actually able to change our children's risk of disease just by changing our lifestyle. What we eat in the years before we conceive our children can actually change their risk of getting diseases like obesity and diabetes. We know that it takes thousands of generations before any real changes are visible to the human race. We go from monkeys to humans. Most of us get a higher stature, and we get less hair growth, and we don't have room enough in our mouths for wisdom teeth. But none of these changes happen to the human race overnight, meaning that what we get from our parents is more or less the same thing we could forward. But new research is telling us otherwise. It shows that the environment we live in can actually be remembered in our egg and in our semen cells, and thereby affect our children. We've known for a long time that the environment we live in affects our body. We know that the risk of developing diseases like cancer, cardiovascular diseases, Alzheimer's, all those diseases are affected by the lifestyle we have. And we know that the environment leaves some traces in our cells. And these traces are kept as marks around the genes that Nikolai just told us about, determining what parts of the genes should be completely ignored, put down in the cell, and what parts of the genes should be more focused on and be allowed to determine our development. And this is really not something new. We've known this for a long time. These marks the environment puts in our body is what we call epigenetics. But the new thing is that these marks left by the environment is also visible in our egg and in our semen cells, thereby affecting their risk of developing diseases. Now, this idea is pretty new. We've only been talking about it for a few years. And the first project that was done to take our focus on this phenomenon was conducted just a few years ago. It was a pretty simple setup. They had a male rat, a female rat, and those rats had some children. we had the male rat had a high-fat diet, becoming very obese. The female rat was normal, slim, and healthy. But yet the children developed obesity and diabetes when they grew older. And this happens even though the rat children had never had any contact with their fat rat, meaning that the only thing that was actually transferred from the dad to his children was the semen cell. So the semen cell must have kept the memory of the fat state the dad had that were able to affect his children's risk of developing the diseases. It's not really possible for us to do the same kind of studies in humans, unfortunately. But new research is telling us that this phenomenon is something we need to take into consideration as well. We've been one of the first to try to look at the marks left by the environment in our semen cells. And we can see that when we look at a group of young Danes being of normal weight, and compare those semen cells to a group of young Danes being obese, we can see that the semen cells are altered, which is a pretty good evidence that something must be put forward that has been affected by their lifestyle. Now, this is not directly in conflict with Darwin's theory of evolution, but it certainly brings a new perspective into the debate of how we evolve from one generation to the next. And what I need you to remember from this talk today is that it actually matters what we do. The lifestyle we have, what we eat, if we exercise or not, if we smoke or not, all those factors might actually be remembered and be able to affect the children. So you need to know that your semen cells actually has a pretty good memory of your bad habits. Thank you.
Hey, so did you know in here that you had trillions of friends for dinner each day? Because inside our gut we have around 1.5 kilograms of gut bacteria. So my name is Trine Nielsen and I'm here to tell you a little bit about how these gut bacteria influence our health. So we have learned in school, at least some of us have learned in school, that bacteria are usually disease causing. So we need different kinds of treatments and antibiotics to get well. But in fact, a lot of these gut bacteria that we carry around in our gut, all of us, a lot of them live in very close symbiosis with us. That means they carry out a lot of those functions that we cannot carry out ourselves. And they are very important for our well-being. So, for example, they help us to digest the food that we consume, so we get the nutrients and vitamins we need to survive. But they're also a very important part of our immune system. The problem with these bacteria is that it's very, very important to us to study them in a normal lab. So traditionally, when we study bacteria, we need to watch them grow in a dish in a lab. But a lot of these bacteria are very difficult or even impossible to grow in a lab. So we need to take other methods into account when we want to study bacteria. And what we do now is that we study the genes of these bacteria. And by studying the genes of these bacteria, we get a much more comprehensive picture of which bacteria we actually have in our gut. But we also get a picture of what they do and what they look like. And what we realize so far is that a lot of these bacteria we haven't known before, and we really don't know what they do. So what we do know about these gut bacteria is that they actually play a role in the development of obesity and diabetes. So an example of this is when we look into mice studies. So if we have a mouse that are germ-free, that is, it has no bacteria in its gut, it will be much leaner than a mouse with bacteria in its gut. And if we take this germ-free mouse and give it bacteria from a normal mouse, it will gain weight. And if we give it bacteria from an obese mouse, it will gain even more weight and become much more like the obese mouse. So if we look into humans, we know that if you have type 2 diabetes, you will have a different composition of your gut bacteria than if you do not have type 2 diabetes. And if I take a sample of your gut bacteria from any one of you in here, I will be able to tell them very precisely actually if you have type 2 diabetes or not. So when we talk about gut bacteria, we actually are all quite unique. We can compare it to a fingerprint. So our gut bacteria, the composition of our gut bacteria are unique to each one of us. But even though it's unique, we are all a little more similar than others. So my gut bacteria will be much more similar to my parents than to my husband's. And twins would have a much more similar gut bacteria composition than other family members. So we know that there is a heritable component in which bacteria we get. But we also know that the gut bacteria are very much influenced by the environment. So in principle, we say that when a child is born sterile. The first bacteria that this baby will get will very much depend on how it's born. So if you're born a normal birth, a vaginal birth, the first bacteria you meet on your journey is the bacteria from the birth canal. But if you're born by a C-section, the first bacteria you get will be from the skin and the surroundings. So already at birth, the gut bacteria depends very much on your surrounding. And when the child gets just a little bit older, which bacteria will inhabit our gut will very much depend on how we are fed. So if we are fed by breasts, we will get one type of bacteria, but if we are fed a cow milk formula, the gut bacteria will be very different. And this of course also changes when we go older and are introduced to solid foods. And it also depends very much on where we live, whether it's in the countryside, among animals and other things, or if we live in the city. And of course it very much depends on which food we get and which diseases we encounter. So at the moment we are looking much more into how many of my gut bacteria do I get because of my genetic background, which one do I get from my family and my ancestors, but also which bacteria do we get from our surroundings that we live in every day. So we also need to know much more about when our gut bacteria become a bad composition instead of a healthy composition and turn into a disease-associated gut bacteria. All of this is something we are looking much more into right now. But of course we hope for the future, and don't be surprised if we will actually see this in the future, that we will be able to modulate our gut bacteria so we can either prevent or treat diseases by modulating the gut bacteria. But until then, please take good care of them.
So in conclusion, I hope you're not too overwhelmed by what you heard. You obviously can't do much on the gene you inherited from your parents. Maybe how your parents behave, you couldn't do much. The bacteria transfer from your mother or your parents, neither. But if you look at the future, it's full of hope, and we hope that we're putting more hope in your brains than being desperate. You've been presented 3 theories, and these theories are negotiable, they're plastic, and this is the beauty of science. None of them are fixed and they evolve. So I hope you come home with your own belief and of one of these theories, if not the 3. And if you have questions, we are welcome to discuss with you in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you.